In 1708, the Blackwood community stopped counting missing men and started whispering prayers. They blamed wolves at first, then bandits, then the forest. But the truth was far closer to home. 3 widows lived at the edge of town, dressed in mourning black, long after their husbands were buried. They were quiet, polite, and always willing to offer travelers warm food and a place to rest. No one questioned them. No one suspected them. Until men began returning changed. Strong farmers grew weak overnight. Confident hunters lost their fire. Some vanished entirely. Those who survived spoke of strange ceremonies, burning herbs, and 3 shadowed figures who believed youth, strength, and fate itself could be taken and transferred through ancient rituals. By the time Blackwood realized what was happening, it was already too late. This is the forgotten story of the 3 widows who turned grief into power and a town into a warning. The autumn of 1708 brought an early frost to Blackwood, a remote hamlet nestled in the shadowed valleys of the Yorkshire moors. The village consisted of no more than 30 souls, scattered among a dozen stone cottages that huddled together against the wind like frightened sheep. It was a place where superstition ran as deep as the roots of the ancient oaks that surrounded it, and where the old ways persisted long after they had faded from more civilized lands. 3 women lived at the edge of Blackwood in cottages that stood apart from the rest. They were widows, all of them, though their husbands had died in vastly different circumstances and times. The villagers called them the 3 Crones, though none of the women had yet seen 50 winters. There was Margaret Ashwood, whose husband had drowned in the peat bog 5 years past. Eleanor Thorne, widowed by consumption a decade ago. And Sarah Blackwell, the youngest, whose husband had fallen from his horse just 2 summers before. The women kept to themselves, tending their gardens and gathering herbs from the moorlands. They were skilled in the preparation of remedies, tinctures for fever, poultices for wounds, teas to ease a difficult childbirth. The village women came to them in secret, though their husbands forbade it, for the church taught that such knowledge smacked of witchcraft. Yet when a child burned with fever, or a wife labored too long, it was to the widow's doors they came, coins hidden in their palms. It was young Thomas Whitley who first noticed something was amiss. A robust farmer of 23, he had recently married Anne, the baker's daughter, and their cottage rang with laughter and the promise of children to come. But one morning in late October, Thomas woke to find himself changed. He could not say precisely what was different, only that he felt diminished, as though some essential part of himself had been drawn away in the night like water from a well. His strength seemed undiminished when he worked his fields, and his appetite remained hearty. Yet in the marriage bed he found himself unable to perform his husbandly duties. Anne wept and blamed herself, but Thomas knew the fault lay with him. He thought perhaps it was fatigue or winter melancholy. But as the days passed and nothing changed, a cold dread settled over him. Then Robert Caldwell, the blacksmith, confessed to the same affliction. He was a bear of a man, 30 years old, with arms like oak branches and a voice that could shake the rafters. Yet he too had awakened one morning to find his masculine vigor mysteriously fled. His wife said nothing, but her eyes held questions she dared not speak aloud. By the time a third man, old Peter Gresham, a widower himself, admitted to the same mysterious ailment. The village was alive with whispered speculation. The men gathered in the tavern, drinking more than was wise, their voices growing loud with fear they could not acknowledge. The women clutched their prayer books and looked sidelong at one another, wondering which among them might be cursed or cursing. It was Reverend Aldrich who first spoke the word that everyone had been thinking: witchcraft. He was a stern man, educated at Cambridge, who had little patience for country superstitions. Yet even he could find no natural explanation for the plague that had befallen the men of Blackwood. He called for a town meeting in the church, where every soul in the village gathered beneath the ancient beams. "There is evil among us," the Reverend declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "The devil himself walks in Blackwood, stealing the God-given essence of our men. We must root out this wickedness before it spreads further." All eyes turned, as if drawn by invisible threads, toward the three widows sitting together in the back pew. Margaret, Eleanor, and Sarah met those stares with level gazes of their own, though Sarah's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "We have done nothing," Margaret said, her voice clear and firm. She was the eldest of the three, with silver threading through her dark hair. "We tend our gardens and harm no one." "Aye," added Eleanor, whose sharp features and sharper tongue had made her few friends in the village. "When your wives came to us for help with their sick children, we were not witches then. Strange how we become convenient villains only when men fail at being men." The church erupted in angry shouts. The Reverend called for silence, but the damage was done. The seed of accusation had been planted, and in the fearful soil of Blackwood, it would grow quickly. That night, the three widows gathered in Margaret's cottage, the largest of the three. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. They sat around the rough wooden table, cups of elderberry wine before them, their faces grave. "They will come for us," Sarah said softly. She was the youngest and the most frightened, for she remembered too well the rumors of witch trials in other villages. "We should flee, go to York or Leeds, somewhere we can disappear." "And confirm their suspicions?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, we stay and we fight." Margaret said nothing for a long moment, staring into the amber depths of her wine. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There is another way." The other two women leaned forward, and Margaret told them of the book, an ancient grimoire that had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through generations of women who had walked the edge between the old knowledge and the new faith. It contained rituals and workings that went far beyond the simple herb law they practiced. Among its pages was a spell, a working of great power that could steal a man's vitality and essence. "But why would we?" Sarah began, then stopped as understanding dawned. "You mean to make the accusation true?" "I mean to give us leverage," Margaret corrected. "If we have truly done what they accuse us of, we can undo it. We can bargain for our safety, our lives." Eleanor's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "And if they refuse to bargain?" Margaret's smile was thin and cold. "Then they remain as they are, and the village learns what it means to make enemies of those who understand the old ways." The ritual required 3 nights of preparation. Under the dark of the moon, the widows gathered nightshade and mandrake root, wormwood and rue. They drew symbols in salt upon Margaret's floor, ancient sigils that predated the cross on the church steeple. They fasted and chanted words in a tongue none of them fully understood, syllables that seemed to make the very air grow thick and heavy. On the third night, with a storm raging outside that bent the trees nearly double, they completed the working. Into a clay vessel, they placed the herbs, the blood of a black rooster, locks of hair they had collected from the men, Thomas, Robert, and Peter. They sealed the vessel with wax and buried it beneath the hearthstone while speaking the final words of the spell. The effect was immediate and terrible. In his cottage, Thomas Whitley cried out in pain, clutching at himself as though wounded. Robert the blacksmith collapsed in his forge, the hammer falling from his nerveless fingers. Old Peter Gresham simply crumpled by his fireside, his face grey with shock. By morning, every man in Blackwood above the age of 15 and below 60 had been similarly afflicted. The village was in chaos. Men who had laughed at the earlier victims now found themselves suffering the same mysterious loss. The Reverend himself, in the privacy of his chamber, discovered that he too had been touched by whatever dark power stalked the village. It was the blacksmith's wife, Martha, who came to the widows' cottages. She was a practical woman, and she had not failed to notice that the affliction had struck every household except those that housed only women and children. She knocked on Margaret's door. Just after dawn, her face set with determination. "I would speak with you," she said, when Margaret answered. "All three of you." They gathered once more around Margaret's table, but this time there were four. Martha looked at each of the widows in turn, her gaze steady despite the fear that surely must have been churning in her belly. "What do you want?" she asked simply. "To bargain for your lives? To punish those who would have seen you burned? Tell me plainly, for I am past the point of games." Margaret respected such directness. "We want three things," she said. "First, the accusations of witchcraft must cease. Second, we are to be left in peace to practice our craft, healing, midwifery, all of it, without interference from church or village. Third, we want compensation for the husbands we lost, for the village did nothing when they died but gossip and judge. And in return, we will undo what has been done. The men will be restored." Martha nodded slowly. "I cannot speak for the village, but I can carry your terms to the others. The women, at least, will listen." She did more than carry the terms. She advocated for them. Martha Caldwell had never been one to mince words, and she didn't start now. She gathered the women of Blackwood in the church while the men lay abed, weakened not in body, but in spirit by their mysterious affliction. "The widows have made their terms," Martha announced, "and I, for one, think them fair. They ask only to be left alone, to be paid honestly for their skills, and to be free from false accusations. In return, our men are restored." "But they have cursed us," cried one woman. "They are servants of Satan." "Are they?" Martha's voice was sharp. "Or are they women who has been persecuted and have finally decided to defend themselves? Ask yourselves this. What would you do if your neighbors accused you of evil? Would you go meekly to the flames, or would you fight?" The debate raged for hours, but in the end, pragmatism won over principle. The women wanted their husbands back, whole and hale, and if the price was leaving 3 widows to their gardens and their herbs, so be it. The bargain was struck on the first day of November, All Saints' Day. The entire village gathered in the church square, the men leaning on their wives for support, the Reverend looking older than his 50 years. Margaret, Eleanor, and Sarah stood before them, and this time no one dared meet their eyes with anything but wary respect. The Reverend spoke the terms in a voice that shook with suppressed rage, but he spoke them nonetheless. The widows would be left unmolested. They would be paid fairly for their services. No accusation of witchcraft would be leveled against them without proof beyond mere suspicion, and the burden of proof would be high indeed. In return, Margaret promised the restoration. That very night, beneath the same hearthstone where the clay vessel lay buried, the three widows performed the counterworking. They broke the seal, scattered the contents to the four winds, and spoke the words that would undo what had been done. By morning, the men of Blackwood woke to find themselves whole once more. Thomas Whitley embraced his wife Anne with tears of relief. Robert Caldwell returned to his forge with renewed vigor. Even old Peter Gresham found himself feeling 10 years younger. But the village was changed. A new understanding had been reached, a balance of power carefully negotiated and more carefully maintained. The widows continued their work, and now women came to them openly, in daylight, with payment in hand. The men gave the 3 cottages at the edge of the village a wide berth, and if the children whispered stories of the widows of Blackwood, they did so with a mixture of fear and grudging admiration. Reverend Aldrich never again preached against the women's work, though he could not quite bring himself to approve of it either. He compromised by ignoring it entirely, turning his attention to other matters of parish life and leaving the widows to their business. As for Margaret, Eleanor, and Sarah, they lived out their days in peace. They had learned a terrible lesson about the power they possessed, both the power of their craft and the power that came from standing together. They used that power sparingly and carefully, for they knew that power without wisdom was more dangerous than powerlessness. And though the grimoire remained hidden beneath Margaret's floorboards, gathering dust in the darkness, they all 3 knew it was there. A reminder, a promise, a warning to any who might forget the bargain struck in Blackwood in the autumn of 1708, when 3 widows showed a village what it meant to push the powerless too far. The story became legend, passed down through generations, whispered among the women of Yorkshire. Some said it was proof of the devil's work in the world. Others said it was a tale of justice delayed but ultimately delivered. But all agreed on one thing. In Blackwood, the old ways had never truly died, and those who remembered them were not to be trifled with. Thus ended the tale of the widows of Blackwood, who stole what should never be stolen and used that theft to purchase their freedom. Whether they were witches in truth or merely cunning women who understood the power of belief, none can say for certain. But their names lived on, and their cottages stood for another 100 years, testament to the price of persecution and the power of those who refused to be victims.